The Guardian, Book 1 of the Gods and Kings Chronicles, by Lee H. Haywood. Available now in both print and ebook formats. Visit leehaywood.com for more details.
Chapter 2. Carrions. My lord, a formation is advancing to the east. It appears the way is blocked. The scout stood at attention, holding his salute. Rancor noted the flaring whites of the scout's eyes and the telltale quiver in his voice. He was afraid of whatever he saw, just like the others. And we can hardly ford the river, said Rancor, motioning to the swift water that ran adjacent to the meadow they were standing in. It was swollen from the recent arrival of spring, and the rolling black current broke in turbulent waves. Rancor felt like such a damned fool. He had done this to his men, letting them get cornered like a hunted deer. They would have us head west, catch us in the narrows between the Jasmine and the Marlin, said Rancor, speaking mostly to himself. Or worse, they have reinforcements hiding within the woods. He eyed the forest with uncertainty. Where is Prince Desperous? A stout elf cloaked in the red cape of the high tower guard presented a map, jabbing at the parchment. My estimates would put the first army here, said Nerso. He was the captain of Rancor's personal guard. He'll not reach us before sundown, said Rancor, eliminating their one hope at salvation. He pensively thumbed the feather of an arrow that hung in the quiver at his hip. He cursed himself. Indecision was bound to get them all killed, and here he was dawdling as if he had time to waste. They had begun the day pursuing what was believed to be a group of bandits, harrying the contested borderland that lie west of the Marlon. Now they found themselves in flight from a division of soldiers bearing the white tower of Caper on their surcoat. The pursuers had become the pursued, and in move after foolish move, Rancor had allowed his men to be driven towards the impassable river. Now they were trapped against the banks of the Marlon, and there was no one to blame except himself. Expectant faces looked at him from all directions, each man certain that their High Lord knew the way to victory. They deserve better than me, thought Rancor gloomily. The men were loyal to a fault. What of the treaty, High Lord? Whispered General Bailrich so that only Rancor could hear. His polished steel breastplate made him stand out like a jewel amongst the drab, livery-clad men about them. Rancor scowled. Treaties were only reliable if the men who signed them could control their people. King Johann had lost the ability to compel his lords through force years ago, and the gold caps in his coffers were ever dwindling. If Rancor had to guess, they were being pursued by a border warden seeking reprisals for some perceived slight. Rancor's corpse would serve as an unexpected trophy to be found after the battle. The treaty would do nothing to protect them today. Battle was coming whether he wanted it or not. Rancor drew his sword. The burnished steel caught the flare of the morning sun, causing it to blaze with ephemeral light. He pointed the tip of his blade in the direction of the woods, sighting down the blood groove. Truce breakers pay a dire price. Beyond is a man who would have the peace between our lands broken. Hear me and be comforted. This aggression will not go unchecked. I welcome his challenge. A half-hearted cry of approval rose up from his men, confirming in Rancor's heart what he had feared. His men wished to fight no more than he did. I state this before all of you, so that there is no confusion in my message. We face unfavorable odds, said Rancor. The men of Caper have our flight blocked in two directions. I will lay my petition before you all. We can fly the field, hoping to outrun any ambush that lie in wait, or we can face the onslaught here. Voice your opinions now. Rancor paced before the small army, looking from one man to the next. Much of their countenance was overshadowed by the lip of their bronze helmets. Still, Rancor detected furrowed brows and uncertain grimaces. None wished to prove the coward and be the first to speak out in a dissenting voice. In the ensuing silence, Rancor could detect the faint thrum of drums wafting from the forest beyond. The presence of the enemy drawing near solidified the decision in each man's mind. We fight for our High Lord, roared Captain Nerso, speaking for the High Tower Guard. Beside him, General Bailrich pumped a pair of spears aloft, spurring the soldiery to respond. Men began to mimic the general's motions, filling the air with the clink and rattle of clashing blades. Rancor nodded in approval, smacking the hilt of his sword to the tri-rays emblem embossed upon his chest. He yelled out to his men, "For Lithuania!" The rally cry came back in unison, "For Lithuania!" The drumming from the forest grew louder, and Rancor's men drunkenly contested the din, screaming at the trees in blatant challenge. Dim shapes began to hem the tree line, but the amorphous figures advanced no further, carefully halting so that they were concealed by the dark shadows thrown by the eaves of the forest. The drums ceased with a final solemn thwack that echoed across the meadow. The black outline of men encompassed their position on three sides. It was impossible to discern the enemy's true number. "Far too many," said Baelrich gloomily. "We can't fix the numbers, only the odds," replied Rancor. He quickly arrayed his men about the crown of a hill, belting out orders and reassurances as he situated his men. A meandering bog protected one of their flanks and the river another. Finally he settled in the center of his army, surrounded by his guard and their looming tower shields. There he waited. The Copernican forces would pay a dire price if they attacked their elevated position. A herald was sent forward to the central plain between the two armies. He held up a white flag, signaling that Rancor would parley if the Copernican leader was willing. For a long while the two armies faced one another. Nothing moved save for the parley flag waving lithely in the wind. Murmurs rose from the elves. "Will they not treat?" whispered one. Others began to pray in the ancient tongue. A horn blared a long, monotone note. The Copernicans emerged from the shadows of the forest and began forward. There would be no negotiations. The herald wheeled and ran for the safety of the Lithuanian lines as quickly as he could. "Wait for my mark!" barked Rancor over the heads of his men. He eyed the intruders with disdain. Many of the soldiers wore suits of red, the colors of the Copernican king. But in amongst them were other colors that Rancor found odd. They more closely resembled an unruly mob of brigands than an army. The enemy broke into a full sprint, the thunder of 1,000 stampeding feet shuddering the plain. 500 paces, 400, 300. "By the gods, they're fast," cried Baelrich. He frantically motioned to the flagmen. "Notch arrows! Ready bows!" "Hold!" yelled Rancor, belaying the hasty order. A deft warrior he may not be, but he understood battle tactics. The enemy had yet to enter the bog. He held his hand parallel to the ground, holding his men at ready. He was watching for the telltale sign of the front line slipping in the mire. The enemy's pace suddenly slackened. Men began to crowd into dense packs as they sloshed through the thick mud. "Now, now! Let loose! Let fly!" screamed Rancor. The signalers waved their flags, and the first volley went hissing through the air. All across the field, the men of Caper fell in a silent tumble of bodies. Fonts of blood painted the drab earth red. A cold shiver ran down Rancor's spine from the unnerving crack of steel-cleaving bone. "Again!" he commanded. Still the enemy came on unabated, clambering over the bodies, until the dead became a ghastly carpet, crushed into the mud beneath the press of pelting feet. "High Lord!" cried Captain Nearso, directing Rancor's gaze to the center of the field. The first of the enemy had cleared the quagmire. They closed the distance to the fleeing herald in an instant. A nonplussed look was planted squarely across the elf's face as he fell. A dozen men pounced, like wolves feasting on a dying deer. They beat at him with fists and tore with tooth and nail. The herald let out a wrenching scream that knotted Rancor's gut. Rancor felt his skin go ashen. "What is this?" "Treachery, my lord," said Baelrich. "Unforgivable treachery." Baelrich crossed his hands across his neck and face in a warding gesture of the faithful. These were not the men of Caper, realized Rancor, as their savage, pinched faces and emaciated frames suddenly came into focus. Many amongst them appeared as the living, wearing armor and bearing swords or spears, but most did not. Some were missing arms and flesh, while others came on naked as if long dead and freshly disinterred from the grave. The front-runners charged as fast as galloping horses. Hundreds more trailed behind them, slowly leaking out of the woods like molasses from a sluice. They were hardly able to propel themselves, draggling forward on wasted joints and shrunken legs. Rancor could hear some of his men openly weeping at the nightmarish sight. A few laid down their bows and began to pray. One man became hysterical and screamed into the air, repenting his sins. The Lithuanian line began to waver. "There is a deserter, High Lord!" Captain Nearso pointed to the east. A young elf had broken rank and was sprinting for the forest, shedding his mail and armor as he went. A handful of the haggard figures sprinted after the soldier. Under his lightened load, there was a chance the elf could make it to the tree line and outrun the enemy in the tangled bramble beyond. Nearso already had an arrow to his string. He looked to Rancor for guidance. His face was oddly impassive. Training had made him an extension of Rancor's own hand. "Put him down," said Rancor. But even as he did, he prayed silently to himself. "Gods forgive me. Not all men are made to face such horrors, but I cannot let this pass." The bolt flew true to its mark and felled the elf at the edge of the forest, pinning him between his shoulder blades. His limp body had hardly struck the ground before the pursuing pack of men ravenously tore into his face and limbs. Nearso knocked another arrow. No other soldiers broke rank. "Stand your ground," barked Rancor. "Spears abreast." The press of the throng was upon them. The ghoulish figures crashed into the front lines at a full sprint. Blades slammed into shields, spears tore through flesh, and all along the line the heavy twang of metal against metal rang loudly. The putrid smell of rot filled the air. The enemy, raw and adorned in the remnants of armor and cloth, hacked into the Lithuanian lines. Even the most vile of humanity could not match such brutality. They buffeted the soldiers with sword and fist alike, clawing with nails, biting with teeth. Rancor was horrified. "We must evacuate you, High Lord," said Nearso, still oddly calm in the midst of the madness. "We have underestimated this enemy." "This is far more than underestimation," shouted Rancor, succumbing to the panic. "This is a darkness never seen in this land." The din of screaming voices and clanging steel made Rancor want to clamp his hands over his ears and flee. He couldn't take it, and his own strength wavered. He considered throwing himself into the river, but was certain the weight of his armor would cause him to drown. Beside him, a soldier died in a spout of blood. Rancor stood wide-eyed and motionless as one of the enemy clambered over the dead man, grasping at him with black fingernails. Baelrich dispatched the foe with a flick of his longsword, beheading the wretched man. "My lord, retreat or fight!" shouted the general, his words sounding much like an order. The sudden fear of dying a cowardly death overpowered all other instincts. What would be his legacy then? They were fully invested. The enemy was pressing them on three sides, and the river galloped mockingly to their rear. Even if it was false gallantry, his men needed to see him act. Rancor unsheathed his sword and pointed towards the battle waging before him. He tried to sound brave as he called out his decree. "My men have no chance to flee, and so shall it be for me." He swallowed his fear and jumped into the fray, forcing his guards to chase after him. With teeth bared, he chopped into a wall of rotting flesh and rusted blades. He swung like a madman, trying to utilize the bravery his father had instilled in him. Yet his skills were not as grand as past generations, and Rancor immediately found himself knocked off his feet. A man with flesh like tanned leather fell atop Rancor. Hand over hand, the man clawed up Rancor's leggings and then his torso. Rancor's feet became entangled in the attacker's trailing intestines. He couldn't lift himself free of the man's weight. Rancor's nostrils filled with the noisome reek of death. Yellow teeth, wreathed by cankered lips, flashed inches before his face. Certain he was going to die, Rancor shoved his forearm into the man's face, anything to fend off that horrid mouth. Teeth lashed onto his arm, and the man reared back with a strip of Rancor's flesh dangling from his clamped jaws. Rancor blanched. The unnerving chill of wavering consciousness rolled over his body. A spear suddenly protruded through the man's eye socket, sending black blood dribbling across Rancor's brow. Captain Nearso heaved the carcass off of him, wrenching the spear free. Bleeding and exhausted, Rancor regained his feet just as a massive shape flew by overhead. The sun was momentarily obscured. It took him a second to construct the image in his mind. "Blessed dragon!" cried Rancor as he watched another of the amazing beasts thunder by. The two dragons jetted skyward like a pair of eagles wheeling on an updraft. They reached an apex directly above the center of the battlefield before crashing down to the earth. Each was as large as a house, with legs the girth of oak trees. With wings pluming like great sails, the magnificent beasts stood as sentinels before the Lithuanian lines. One was light gray with speckled scales and a pointed beak. The other was the color of white marble, marked by black streaks and a blunted nose. Blood-curdling roars rattled from their throats as they lashed into the throng of enemies, sending the haggard men flying like rag dolls. The press on the Lithuanian lines abated as the enemy turned their wrath against the dragons. Hands and feet could do little against the dragon's thickly scaled hides. Rising up on its haunches, the white dragon thrust her slender neck forward, letting out a swath of boiling air. "Dragon fire," said Rancor, in awe of what he was seeing. The blast of superheated gas engulfed all it struck in vibrant flames. The surging fire licked over its victim, and for a moment it seemed all whom the fire touched were enlivened by some unheard melody. Arms flailed, legs kicked madly, heads swung to and fro. Flesh wicked away like wax, until finally the wretched bodies withered to the ground. There they gave a few more spastic jerks before succumbing to the flame. "All is not lost," roared General Baelrich, finding the words that were trapped in Rancor's throat. "The dragons have come to our aid. Force the enemy from the field." Rancor's world became awash in red light and depthless blacks. The meadow was a sea of flame. The sky disappeared behind a blanket of smoke. "The dragons have come to our aid," Rancor repeated numbly. "Thank the gods, the dragons have come to our aid."